Thank you for joining us today. Our program is Liberties, Diaspora, Black Women's Routes to Liberation in the Age of the American Revolution. Our presenter today is Dr. Barbara Krauthamer. She comes to us from University of Massachusetts in Amherst. She's the Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and a professor of history at the college. Dr. Krauthamer, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you all this evening. And, you know, I'm sure we planned it this way, but of course, I felt like tonight's the perfect night, just coming on the heels of a couple of weeks after Juneteenth and just after July 4th, to give this presentation and share some of my research with you. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time afterwards for questions. I'm going to share my screen so you all have some images and slides and maps and pictures to look at rather than just staring at me the whole time. I thought that would be more interesting for you. So if you bear with me for 1 second, I will get this set up. Right, and you should all be seeing a map of Virginia, right? I see someone nodding, so I think we're going okay. All right, so the work I'm going to share with you this evening is from a research project that I've been working on for a couple of years now that started with my interest in researching the lives of enslaved women who escaped from slavery and freed themselves. And I found myself, most of my other work concentrates on the Civil War era from the 1830s through the 1870s, 1880s. And as I started this research project, I found myself getting more interested in the earlier period, in the late 18th century and the very early 19th century. And so I started doing a lot more research on enslaved women in particular who escaped from slavery during the era of the American Revolution. So the first story that I want to share with you is a story about a woman named Mary, who in the spring of 1776 successfully leads her 3 daughters, Patience, age 12, Hannah, age 8, and Zilpha, age 4. She takes her 3 daughters away from their enslavers' Tidewater plantation to the British fleet that is anchored just off the Virginia coast, right around Norfolk. And you know, so this is obviously a modern map, but I figured it was much easier to see. Mary and her 3 daughters were part of a much larger group of about 87 people who were escaping from a man named John Willoughby, who owned them. And their intent was very clearly to gain their freedom. And this story, and Mary's story, you'll hear bits of throughout the presentation, is really only one of countless acts of thousands and thousands of enslaved people taking it upon themselves to liberate themselves, to free themselves during the American Revolution. When Mary and her daughters and the others from the Willoughby plantation got to Mills Point, which is just near, I've lost my cursor, here we go. Mills Point is just near Portsmouth, Virginia, right here. When they got there, they went there deliberately because of the British colonial governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had issued, oops, let's see, where is the, here we go, had issued his proclamation, what we know as Dunmore's Proclamation. In the fall of 1775, in November, Lord Dunmore, who was the colonial governor of Virginia, had published a proclamation that pledged to free, quote, all indented servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels. So that means, you know, other unfree people claimed by the rebels, and that he promised to free them if they would bear arms and join His Majesty's troops, right? Join the British troops. Now, Dunmore issues his proclamation not because he's so committed to the idea of ending slavery or liberating enslaved people or liberating indentured servants. He's not motivated by ideas of racial equality, for example. He's motivated by a desire to quash the rebellion, right? To quash the beginning of what will become the revolution. And so he issues this proclamation with the goal of inciting fear among slave owners that their human property, they will lose their human property, those people that they own as property. And of course, he also had the additional hope of wanting to increase the size of his forces, right, of his troops by recruiting Black men to his ranks. And so within weeks of Dunmore issuing his proclamation, several hundred enslaved men from Virginia make their way to the British vessels that are anchored right there off the coast near Portsmouth and Norfolk. And they're organized into what was called the Ethiopian Regiment. And at the same time that men are joining the British forces, enslaved women are also making their way to British camps up and down the East Coast. So from Virginia all the way up to New York, enslaved women and men immediately recognize the possibility of freeing themselves in the revolution, right? So making the revolution an opportunity for their liberation. Even though that was, not on the agenda of either the British or the rebels or patriots, however we would want to term them. And so enslaved women recognized very quickly this opportunity for self-liberation. And enslavers and leading men on both sides of the fight, right? Both the loyalists and the patriots recognize very quickly that enslaved women are part of this campaign, these swelling numbers of enslaved people who are motivated to free themselves. And so Virginian, Edmund Randolph, who serves in the Constitutional Convention after the war, serves as Attorney General and then as Secretary of State under George Washington. Randolph recalled that enslaved women were as capable of resisting capture and re-enslavement as men. He wrote at one point that the women, meaning African-American enslaved women, quote, could handle deadly weapons. Right, that they were as capable of fighting to defend themselves and protect themselves against capture as men. By the time the war ends, by the time the revolution ends in 1783, about 20,000 enslaved women, men, and children, and so that would include Mary and her 3 daughters, will have gained their freedom by connecting themselves to British forces at some point during the war. Some people are captured and re-enslaved, but most of those 20,000, right, evacuate, leave the former colonies at the war's end and go to other points in the British Empire. And so that's the diaspora, right? This movement of formerly enslaved people of African descent who had been brought to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade, again, embark on movement throughout the Americas and across the Atlantic. Some will return, will go to London, and eventually some will settle in Sierra Leone, which is a British colony. People also move to the Caribbean. So there's a lot of movement and migration of these approximately 20,000 people after the American Revolution. Now, what's important to note is that enslaved people's resistance and rebellion predated the American Revolution, right? So we're already long before the history of Juneteenth and the liberation of enslaved people at the end of the American Civil War, right? But enslaved people's resistance and efforts to free themselves predates the American Revolution and predates Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And so the point being, of course, that enslaved African-born men and women and their American-born children didn't need Lord Dunmore or the American Revolution to plant the idea of liberty and freedom in their minds. There, almost since the earliest arrival of enslaved people in the Americas, there were incidents of escape and resistance and rebellion. For women prior to the revolution, most women who sought permanent escape, that is, sought to free themselves completely, typically would hide out in the anonymity of bustling port cities, places where they could easily find employment with either white employers who wouldn't ask a question about their legal status, free or enslaved, or with free Black employers. And so it was easier for women to disappear into the very mobile and transitory Black populations of enslaved people and free Black workers and Black sailors in port cities. And so for women who are seeking to escape both before and during and after the revolution, their escape, their taking control of their bodies and their lives, was perceived as really a double blow to slaveholders, because by taking control of their bodies, right, freeing their bodies from forced labor, from being owned as property by someone else, they were also taking their capacity to reproduce, to have children. And one of the things that's important to know about the history of slavery is that the laws of slavery held that children born to enslaved mothers were born legally as the property of the mother's owner. So when a woman escaped and freed herself, she was also freeing her reproductive capacity, right? That is, that ability to give birth to children. And as a free woman, children would be born as the child of the mother rather than as the property of the owner. So for enslaved women, that kind of self-liberation had always had a double meaning and a double value, that they were securing the future freedom of their future children. Also, before the American Revolution and before Lord Dunmore's proclamation, there's one event in particular that also spurs both enslaved women and enslaved men to start thinking more about not only escaping, but using the British as allies in their escapes. And that is a 1772 court case in England, in which the first Earl of Mansfield, Lord Mansfield, also known as William Murray, ruled in the case of James Somerset. James Somerset was an African-born man who was brought to North America in 1749 on a slaving vessel. He was purchased by a man named Charles Stewart, who was a Scots merchant in Norfolk, Virginia. Stewart moves from Virginia to Boston to serve as the customs officer in Boston, and he brings Somerset with him as his property, as his possession. In 1769, Stewart then travels to London and again brings James Somerset with him as his personal property. 2 years later, in 1771, James Somerset will run away from Stewart in England, but he's captured and imprisoned. And Stewart enters into an agreement with the captain of a slave ship that the ship will take Somerset as part of the cargo to Jamaica, and that Somerset will be sold as an enslaved person in Jamaica. And so British abolitionists intervene in this case on behalf of James Somerset. They bring the case to court. And in the summer of 1772, June 22nd, Lord Mansfield rules that enslaved people, including James Somerset, cannot be removed against their will from England. So it doesn't abolish slavery in England. It doesn't abolish slavery in the English colonies, but it does say that you can't forcibly remove an enslaved person against their will from England. Well, news of the Somerset case spreads very quickly among England's African descended population. There are reports of great celebrations in public halls and public spaces. One London newspaper reported that nearly 200 Black men and women gathered in Westminster, quote, to celebrate the triumph which their brother Somerset had obtained over Mr. Stewart, his master. Lord Mansfield's health was toasted around the room, and the evening concluded with a ball. So I mention this story for two reasons. One, because the news of the Somerset case will travel back to the North American colonies, and again, you know, start to ignite enslaved people's interest in allying with the British to secure their freedom. And two, because the story reminds us that that London, and indeed in all of England, had a vibrant Black population in the 1700s and before. And that London too is part of the intellectual world of debates over the meanings of slavery and freedom in this era of revolution. And so I just wanted to include here two portraits, one of a man named Ignatius Sancho and the other of a woman named Dido. She was the daughter of a naval officer and an enslaved Black woman from the West Indies. And it's believed, not fully documented or certain, but it's believed that in fact, Lord Mansfield, who issues that ruling in the Somerset case, was her great uncle. And Ignatius Sancho was an enslaved child in England. He was emancipated by the time he reached adulthood, and then will go on to achieve real fame as an anti-slavery writer, as a thoughtful intellectual. He's also a business owner and is really just a talented political thinker and creative artist, as well as a writer and a composer of music. So news of this case, right? News of this Somerset case makes its way, both causes excitement in London, especially among the Black community there, and also causes excitement among Black communities in North America. And there are reports in newspapers throughout the colonies in which slaveholders in the colonies, of course, lament this decision and worry greatly that it will spark unrest and rebellion among the people they own. And so we've seen newspaper notices in the months and year after the Somerset decision, in which enslaved people are escaping, women and men are escaping and are suspected of trying to secure passage to England, where they believe they will be safer and more secure from forced labor and enslavement. Typically, most people tended to believe that the ruling abolished slavery completely, which it did not. So Lord Dunmore, back in Virginia, assumes his post as the royal governor of Virginia right around the time of this, the Somerset case. And so the idea of the potential of enslaved people's unrest and efforts to claim their freedom is very much on his mind too. So by the time we get to 1775, just after Lexington and Concord, right, it's Dunmore who really lights that spark of enslaved resistance and rebellion when he issues his proclamation. Newspaper reports in Virginia will describe, quote, boatloads of people joining Dunmore. Within a week after his proclamation, he estimated that about 300 enslaved people had come aboard his ships, again, both women and men. Enslaved women like Mary Williams, who I described to you at the beginning, also makes her way to Dunmore's fleet in that spring of 1776. But what she drew on, and what makes her story so fascinating, is that she had a long history of distancing herself from her enslaver and from his plantation. And she had a long history of really being a leader of this kind of ongoing resistance and a leader in her community. For about 4 years prior to joining Dunmore's camp in 1776, she had been escaping from her enslaver's plantation at night, carrying her children and walking about 10 miles or so to participate in clandestine religious gatherings with other enslaved people in the area. She had acquired some literacy, probably from an itinerant preacher. She had professed her conversion to Methodism. She had some familiarity with the Bible. And so she became established as a leader in prayer and song and worship. And so she would go off at night, and then she would return in the early hours of the morning in time to begin her workday on the plantation. So she, again, knew the terrain, right? Had that knowledge of the geography, had that knowledge of how to navigate herself and her children and her community to the coast to reach Dunmore's fleet in the spring of 1776. By the time they get there, by the time they get to Dunmore's fleet, a smallpox epidemic was tearing through the camp. And so that cut short the freedom of many women and men who arrived there. Dunmore hoped that naval surgeons would be able, there are a lot of resonances to today. He hoped that naval surgeons would be able to inoculate the newly arriving Black women and men against the virus. As I was reading that part of my notes the other day, I was sort of struck by the resonance to today. Slaveholders up and down the Atlantic coast are outraged and alarmed by Dunmore's proclamation. And again, the steady flow up and down the coast from New York to Virginia to Georgia and South Carolina. There's really a steady flow of enslaved people making their way to British camps to secure their liberation. By the summer of 1776 into the early fall, thousands of Black people go with British forces from Virginia to New York and settle in New York City, where again they have the opportunity to interact with free Black communities, enslaved Black people, and British communities in the military barracks in Manhattan and Brooklyn. And throughout the war, there are ongoing negotiations for the return of enslaved people to their patriot owners. And these negotiations are typically not very successful. And perhaps the most notable unsuccessful case was that of George Washington, who attempted to regain possession of 3 people, a woman named Deborah, and 2 men, Henry Washington and Daniel Payne. And he was unsuccessful, and they gained their freedom by making their way to the British and retained their freedom after the war. So by the time the war ends in 1783, most of those 20,000 Black women, men, and children will evacuate with the British, mainly to Canada. Some will go to England, but most go to Canada. And a man named Boston King, whose memoir is here. These are the three predominant Black preachers in this community of self-liberated people. And Boston King had escaped from slavery on a British vessel. And he wrote about how afraid the formerly enslaved women and men were of being re-enslaved at the end of the Revolution. He wrote, "The thought, quote, fills us with inexpressible anguish and terror. Many slaves had very cruel masters, so that the thought of returning home with them embittered life to us. For some days we lost our appetite for food and the sleep departed from our eyes." And so really you can imagine, right, that sense of terror that people had after having successfully escaped from plantations, from those who enslaved them, and then worrying at the end of the war that they would be returned to bondage. What happens in the end in 1783 is that the British and the English and the Americans prepare a register, right, that lists the names, ages, and birthplaces of all of the Black women and men and children who have escaped to the British, who are going to leave now after the war is over with the British. And so that document is typically called the Book of Negros. And so this is just an image of a display in the Canadian National Archives. So you can see it's a very large ledger, and you can see down one side are people's names and ages, and then notations on the other side would say who the person's former owner was, where they escaped, if there were any notations about special skills that a person had. One of the most interesting things to me in the book, and so here's just the front piece of it where you can see it says Book of Negros, registered and certified. and so each person has to sort of give their testimony to the British officers certifying that indeed they have escaped and they want to be free. One of the most notable things to me about the book, about this register, is that it registers both women and their children. And so we can see, for example, the women who had children that were freeborn, right? Children that were born after women escaped, which means again that those babies were born as that mother's child rather than as someone else's property. So just a couple of examples for you. This is a woman named Jane Milligan, who was 20 years old, and her daughter Maria Milligan, who was 9 months old. So her daughter, she became pregnant and gave birth to her daughter shortly before evacuating from New York to go to Nova Scotia. Mary Williams, who I've told you a little bit about, likewise, is also on here. She's listed as Mary Perth because she marries a man named Caesar Perth after she escapes. And here are her 3 daughters, Zilpha, Hannah, and Patience are also listed with her. So what this register allows us to do is see women's family relationships, see their community relationships. Down here at the bottom, you can see Boston King, the preacher who I read to you about, his fear about being re-enslaved. Boston King was on this same ship as Mary Perth. And I wanted to share just a couple of other images with you. So what happens is the tens of thousands of formerly enslaved African-American women, men, and children evacuate from New York and resettle in Nova Scotia. This is one of the very, very few visual images we have of this group of people. This is a watercolor of a woman named Rose Fortune, who came with her family. Her father's name was Fortune, who came to Nova Scotia with his wife and young daughter when she was about 10 years old. I recently came across this painting by a man named Robert Petley, who is a British Canadian artist. This is a painting from 1835, so well after the Revolution. But again, just sort of presents an idyllic picture of Black life in Nova Scotia. This is Halifax Harbor in the distance here. And so, sort of a romantic picture of Black agricultural life in Nova Scotia after the Revolution. The reality was a little bit different. Most Nova Scotians, Black Nova Scotians, settled in some of these towns. So here's Halifax. Most people were disembarked here at Birchtown and settled in these communities that are marked here. Shelburne was a main community, some were in Annapolis, others in Halifax. And the people who gained their freedom during the war and then relocated to Nova Scotia did not immediately find sort of a glorious life as free people. Slavery was still legal in Nova Scotia under British rule. And so the same racist hierarchies and racist ideals about Black inferiority defined much of the local society in Nova Scotia. The area also posed a really great, and so people also lived, I wanted to show you this, people really lived under the most rudimentary and basic conditions. These were dugout homes in the Birchtown settlement area just south of Halifax, where people were living really with the most basic shelters, often wanting for food and clothing, especially in the colder weather months. The fact that slavery was legal in Nova Scotia posed a great threat primarily to women. And so I'll end with a couple of stories about the lives of women in Nova Scotia, and then some of the incidents that prompt a further migration and inspires some women to join a settlement movement and move from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone in West Africa. But in one story that is not unique, in 1791, a woman named Mary Postal charges that a man named Jesse Gray stole her daughter from her in Nova Scotia, stole and enslaved her daughter, and sold the daughter into slavery in North Carolina. Mary had escaped with the British in South Carolina during the war and had evacuated to Nova Scotia at the end of the war. She had worked for this man who was a British loyalist named Jesse Gray, who promised that he would take good care of her and her daughter. However, when they got to Nova Scotia and settled in Nova Scotia, Jesse Gray claimed that he continued to own Mary as his property and that he also owned her two daughters, Nellie and Flora. So he then had 10-year-old Flora shipped to North Carolina and sold as a slave. Mary was able to file a lawsuit with the help of some friends and allies against Jesse Gray. The jury found Jesse Gray guilty of falsely imprisoning and enslaving Mary and her daughters, who should have been freed. The jury called him a, quote, wicked and evil disposed person. So Mary won her court case, but she never got her daughter back. Her daughter was never located and never returned to her mother. So the freedom that Mary acquired in Nova Scotia, was a freedom that was still marked by loss and pain to the institution of slavery. Likewise, the story of Lydia Jackson points again to the real difficulty that women had in securing their freedom. Lydia Jackson also evacuated from New York, settled in Nova Scotia. She and her husband eventually separated, and she needed to find employment. She accepted employment from a man named Henry Headley, who was a loyalist from Massachusetts, who offered her a paid position as a domestic servant in his home. Lydia Jackson moved into the Headley household, at which point Headley claimed that he owned her as a slave, and told her that the only way that she would be able to secure her freedom was that instead of receiving wages, she would have to pay the Headley family, to compensate them for housing her. They finally negotiate an agreement, and Lydia believes that she's entering into a labor contract for 1 year. She was not able to read or write, and in fact, the written document that Headley prepared was a contract of unfree labor for 39 years. So basically the rest of Lydia's viable life. Headley then sold that contract to a local physician, so effectively sold Lydia Jackson as an unfree laborer to a local physician who beat her regularly, she said, with tongs and sticks, and whipped her with pieces of rope, and routinely threatened to sell her to a Caribbean plantation. And finally, with the assistance of British abolitionists, she was able to gain her freedom. And so I share these stories with you, as the reminder that freedom was never easily defined or guaranteed for Black people, especially Black women, during and after the revolution, even in light of Dunmore's proclamation and British efforts to secure safe passage and resettlement in Nova Scotia. And so I'll end, of course, because we are in Massachusetts, with the slide of Elizabeth Freeman, right, who also sued for her freedom in Massachusetts. So she was not part of this diaspora of enslaved people gaining freedom by leaving, by moving. But I thought it was just a fitting end to thinking about enslaved women's intellectual lives and their ability to engage with the political issues of their day, in this case, the revolution, and to make it meaningful and relevant to their own lives. And, the thing that I always say about Elizabeth Freeman, and especially after living in the Berkshires for many years and really just being so appreciative of all the work that's been done by the local community in the Berkshires to make her story available, is that the white family that had once enslaved her, future generations of the Sedgwick family, often referred to her as Mum Bet. And so that might be a name that people are familiar with. And I always tell people that I'm uncomfortable with that, because that's a name that she was called by other people, and calling enslaved woman mum in the Northeast, or mammy or auntie in the mid-Atlantic and southern states was a form not so much of respect, but of disrespect, right? Because it was a form of informality, right? That rather than calling someone Miss or Mrs., right, that it was a way of diminishing that woman's status, right? In the same way that calling men, calling them boys or uncle, was a way of diminishing their status. And so I always say that it's important to look at Elizabeth Freeman and all of these other women, how they saw themselves. And in the case of Elizabeth Freeman, we know from the documentation that the name she called herself when she gained her freedom was Elizabeth Freeman. She didn't call herself by a nickname or a diminutive, but she named herself in her freedom. And so I think that's a fitting end to thinking about enslaved women's efforts to create meaningful lives for themselves during and after the revolution, and an important reminder of seeing Black women and thinking about Black women as intellectual actors who had a sense of self that motivated their actions, and that, you know, continues to motivate their actions throughout the whole of American history. So I'm going to stop there, and let's see if I can figure out how to unshare my screen here. There we go. I will stop there, and I am happy in the remaining 15 or 20 minutes or so to answer any questions or hear any thoughts that people might want to share about this work or related topics.
I'd like to start by thanking you so much for this presentation. And with the public. I don't have any questions in the chat box right now. Just a reminder to everyone that this program is being recorded. So if you prefer not to be recorded, to leave your microphone off and to use a chat box instead, but everybody should be able to turn on their mics at this time. We do still have some applause for you in the audience. Since we don't have any questions in the chat box yet, I guess I have a couple of questions. You talked a lot about women and their bodies and taking control over their reproduction again. How did their attempts to obtain their freedom with their children, like, was that considered theft? Were there harsher punishments? Could you talk a little about the big risk, like the even bigger risks maybe of that choice, and how different people approached it?
Sure, absolutely. So it was certainly considered theft, right? And this is the thing that I always like people to sit with for a second, right? For an enslaved person to escape, right, was considered a kind of theft, right? Because that person was legally owned and defined as property, right? So for an enslaved woman is really committing, right, multiple acts of theft, if you will, because she's taking her reproductive capacity. And one of the things, I have a dear friend named Jennifer Morgan, who's written just beautiful scholarship that shows that slaveholders, for example, in their wills would bequeath not only an enslaved woman, but unborn children. Right, so a person might say, you know, I leave to my child, you know, I leave to my heirs, my son, the enslaved woman named Dolly, and I leave to my other son any children born to the enslaved woman Dolly. And that woman might not have given birth yet, but the enslaved owner's rights of property extended into the future. So yes, it was certainly considered an act of theft. And there are many, many examples of, you know, and especially in the Revolutionary era, of the kinds of physical punishments that were imposed on women who tried to escape, you know, including things like cropping their ears or cutting off their toe, you know, crippling people, right? So cutting off toes, putting heavy iron chains on them to prevent them from leaving. And so for anyone who has dealt with little children, if you think about, Mary Williams, the story I started with, escaping with 3 children under the age of 12, from 12 to age 4, and what kind of effort and determination that must have had, she must have had. I once had a student who said, yeah, but Professor Krauthamer, if she was sneaking off at night with her children to go to prayer services, she was basically in training for this for 4 years. And I hadn't really thought about that. And my student was like, that's like training for a marathon, like every night walking that distance, like that's physical activity. And I thought, and that we see that with a lot of these stories that enslaved women are practicing, right? They escape for short periods of time where they're gathering knowledge and sharing knowledge. I see a question. What punishment for the Massachusetts loyalist who claimed the woman was his slave and sold her daughter? In the end, there was no real punishment, right? The jury found him guilty, but nothing, there was no punishment. And, in the end, the woman's never reunited with her daughter. So, she really suffers the greater punishment in the end.
Was that a civil case instead of a legal case? Or was there a distinction back then?
Say it again?
Was that a civil case or a legal case, or was there not a distinction back then?
Oh, it was a civil case. It was brought to the courts in Nova Scotia.
Okay. There was another question in the chat box. How did the Patriots resolve this issue after the war?
Resolve the issue of the enslaved people they lost. I'm not sure what, the Patriots were not happy about that. I will say, as I said, George Washington, to the bitter end, is writing letters and seeking to reclaim. And if anyone's read the other book about the enslaved woman who escapes from Washington, from Philadelphia and Virginia, start to see a pattern that people were escaping from him. He never caught is the title. Thank you. Yes. And, the author is a good friend of mine, so I should have remembered. But it's a great, great book about this time period. The Patriots resolved the issue in a variety of ways, right? We know in some areas, there's a movement towards manumission, right? Not in all of the northern states, but in some areas. Interestingly enough, many of the laws governing slavery are actually a bit, I don't know what the right word is, a bit less restrictive and less harsh in the years after the revolution. And, some of the theorizing about that is that there's some intellectual wrestling with that fundamental contradiction between, being this emerging nation that's placing a premium on individual rights and liberties and, maintaining this institution of chattel slavery. So in many places, it's not illegal for enslaved people to have access to religion, to have access to some education, right? And that really shifts by the 1830s. Right, and so related to this, was there a crackdown and greater severity in dealing with escapees? Right, and so that sort of harsher, the harsher laws, the more draconian laws, the more extreme laws we really see coming into being in the 1830s. But what I will say about this is in the Constitution and in 1797, there are laws that are very clear that an enslaved person who escapes from slavery in one state and makes it to a state where slavery is not legal, that does not free the person, that the person remains the property of their owner, right? And this is in the Constitution, and then it's enshrined in federal law in 1797, that says very clearly that escaping to a free state does not confer freedom, that the person retains their status as property.
Did any states at any point start to try to write laws to change that, to fight that, or was that not until after the Civil War?
Wait, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Did individual states at any point try to challenge that, to start to write their own laws to challenge the federal laws?
Well, so right. So one of the things that happens in the wake of the revolution, right, is that some states abolish slavery more quickly than others. Places like New York, for example, implement what's called gradual abolition, right, starting from 1799, and pass laws that set future dates for the emancipation of enslaved people. And so there's always this sort of straddling that line in those states that, moving towards the end of the institution in the state, but also wanting to preserve the value, if you will, of enslaved people as property for the people who own them. So the laws in 1799, right, say that people will be emancipated, when young men turn 18. People born after 1799 will become free. For men, I think it's after the age of 18, and I think it's for women, it's after the age of 21 or something. So what that does is mean that the person who enslaves them still has those young adult years of labor that they can claim. And they still have the labor of people born before 1799. And then there's subsequent laws that retroactively, or that go prior to 1799, to emancipate people born prior to 1799. So, but the laws are designed still to protect that property right and the ability to extract labor and value from owning enslaved people. Yes, I see that one. Yes, so there's a second fugitive slave law, right? So we see the Constitution in 1797, and then 1850 is the real draconian fugitive slave law that denies enslaved people the right to testify on their own behalf, that makes it a federal crime to assist or even know about an enslaved person who has escaped and not report to the authorities. It gives broad power to federal marshals. It gives them the power to forcibly enlist local law enforcement and local citizens in capturing suspected fugitives. And it really lowers the bar for quote unquote proof of ownership, if you will. So a person can be kidnapped and someone can make a claim that they owned that person, and there was very little burden of proof. And so, yes, so that absolutely, historians recognize that 1850 fugitive slave law as one of the events in the 1850s that really spark that sectional crisis and start on the road to the Civil War in 1861. If anyone's seen the Solomon Northup movie, 12 Years a Slave, from a number of years ago, Solomon Northup was a free Black man in upstate New York who was kidnapped and enslaved in the Deep South, and then later writes an autobiography that's called 12 Years a Slave that becomes then the basis for the film. And so that's very much his story, right? That he's captured and enslaved, though he was legally a free man. The book Negros is not available online, but it is available. I mean, yeah, it's available online. It's not available for purchase. But it is available as a searchable database. And if you bear with me for 2 seconds, I will try to type and speak at the same time. No, here we go. And I can put the link in, here we go. So there are 2 copies. There's the American copy, which is in the National Archives in DC. And there's the British copy, which is in the National Archives in England. The Canadian archives, because of the centrality to Canadian history, the Canadian National Archives have digitized it. So it's actually searchable, which is really fascinating. So you can, put in the word Connecticut, and it'll pull up everyone who escaped from slavery in Connecticut who was registered and who evacuated to Nova Scotia. So I put in the chat a link, and you can even just find it by Googling. And so it's really interesting to look at and to see the notations. I will say, do not be confused. There is also a novel by the titled The Book of Negros that's a fictionalized, the author sort of imagining the life of a woman based on this history. And then it was made into a mini series as well. Yeah, right. Somebody said in the chat, lists like this could be used if there were ever reparations. Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, it's one of the really incredible things about delving into these archives, because in some ways, you know, they were all military records. There's a lot of meticulous notation, right, of who embarked on ships, who disembarked, where they settled. So there really is just a wealth of information for genealogists and historians to work with.
I have a question. One of the later stories that you were telling was, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name offhand, but the woman who could not read or write, who was tricked into signing
Oh, yeah.
a contract basically for the rest of her life. Were there any movements or efforts to help freed slaves who could not read or write? Like, was there any history that we know of about that?
Sure. So for those communities that settle in Nova Scotia, there are certainly efforts to organize schools locally. Some led by, you know, people like Mary Williams, right, who had that experience, had some literacy and some familiarity with the Bible, were able to teach. The other source of teachers and education came from British abolitionists, right, British anti-slavery activists and British missionaries, who were also in Nova Scotia, you know, in part just as colonial settlers, and in part as in relation to this evacuation of 20,000 African Americans from New York. And so in response to the next question in here about England and Sierra Leone, so one of the things that happens, right, is that these communities that settle in Nova Scotia, remember I showed you that dugout hut, like conditions in Nova Scotia were really just brutal. The winters were brutal. There's not a lot of agriculture. So people were cold, people were starving. The British didn't have ample supplies of rations and were not supplying ample supplies of rations. And British missionaries and authorities eventually secure a number of people, commitments from a number of these Black settlers in Nova Scotia to relocate again to Sierra Leone. And so in fact, Harry Washington, the man who escapes from George Washington, is one of the people who goes to Sierra Leone. Mary Williams and her 3 daughters and her new husband go to Sierra Leone. The preacher Boston King, whose excerpts I read to you, you know, about the fear of re-enslavement, he also goes to Sierra Leone. And so what is really amazing that the letters have survived is that there is some communication with family and friends in the United States, because there's continued interest in some corners, in some Black communities, especially free Black communities in New England, in potentially relocating, right? So there's a man in Rhode Island named Paul Cuffey, who in the early 1800s, right, is interested in bringing African Americans from the United States to settle in Sierra Leone. So there's some communication there. There's also communication among those who go to Sierra Leone with people in Jamaica as well as in the United States, because there's also a semi-forced migration of formerly enslaved rebels from Jamaica. Men and women are relocated from Jamaica first to Nova Scotia, right? Because Jamaica is a British colony as well, are relocated from Jamaica to Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. And so there's some letters, mainly, maybe even exclusively from men, usually writing to authorities more than their families and friends, but documenting their lives. Were they any safer in Sierra Leone? Yes, yes, definitely a reverse diaspora. Yes and no, right? They were not at risk for re-enslavement, but they were certainly in a place that did not feel like home, that was not their home. They were certainly separated from family members and community members and loved ones who either stayed in Nova Scotia or who never were able to escape during the revolution in the first place. So, you know, in the documentation, there's very much a sense of dislocation. And, you know, the conditions in Sierra Leone were not necessarily any better. They were just different, but, you know, different kinds of diseases and want for resources, but certainly not the risk of re-enslavement that we see in places like Nova Scotia.
Do you have any final questions or comments? We're just at about 7:30 right now. So just give a moment. Feel free to raise your hand, which should be in the reactions or under more. If you want to raise your hand, if you need any assistance. Somebody asked, do you have any books we could read?
Oh, that's very kind of you. I do, not about this, because this is part of a book that I'm working on, but I have a book called Envisioning Emancipation that is of the Civil War era African-American photography, and photographs of enslaved and emancipated individuals. That's called, let's see if I can type and speak, Envisioning Emancipation. And I also have a book called Black Slaves, Indian Masters, that's about the lives of people who were enslaved by Native Americans in the Deep South, who were enslaved in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations primarily.
Looks like, I mean, I know I have those, but I'm going to write those down just in case and send those to everybody when the video is ready in case anyone is interested. So I see there were several thank yous throughout the chat earlier, and there's some now and some applause again. So I want to, Dr. Krauthamer, I'd like to thank you again for this presentation and for the wonderful discussion we had, and thank everyone for joining us. Again, you'll be sent the video link so you can revisit it or share it with other people who might be interested to watch this presentation. So I hope you all have a good night.
Great, thank you all. I appreciate the time.